What if the audience that built you bought every album, memorized every lyric, and filled every arena you ever played, decided overnight that you were the enemy? Heavy metal fans are the most devoted community in music. They do not follow bands casually, they invest. They tattoo the logos on their skin. They drive hundreds of miles for a show. And when they feel betrayed by the person they gave all of that loyalty to, the fury they bring is proportional to the devotion they once had. These are not stories about critics turning on musicians. Critics never mattered in this genre. These are stories about something far more personal and far more devastating. These are 15 heavy metal stars who were eaten alive by their own fans. 15. M Shadows. M Shadows built Avenged Sevenfold into one of the most commercially successful and genuinely devoted fan bases in modern heavy metal. And the relationship between the band and the community that had followed them from the metalcore years through their mainstream commercial peak was built on a sense of mutual investment that most acts in the genre never achieve at the same intensity. The fan base called themselves the Death Bats. They were organized, passionate, and vocal. They were exactly the kind of community that a band earns through years of genuine creative engagement rather than commercial calculation. Then came the Death Bats Club. In 2022, the band launched an NFT project that offered digital membership cards and various exclusive benefits to purchasers at prices that most of the fan base found somewhere between baffling and insulting. The heavy metal community's relationship with blockchain technology and digital collectibles was already skeptical before the announcement arrived, and the specific framing of the project as a premium tier of fan engagement generated a backlash from devoted followers who felt the band had monetized the loyalty they had spent years building without adequately considering what that transaction communicated about the relationship. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, M Shadows experienced one of the most specifically modern versions of the phenomenon. A musician whose fan base felt their devotion had been treated as a revenue stream rather than a genuine human connection. The anger was disproportionate to the actual harm caused, which is how genuine fan betrayal always operates. The fans who burned the hardest were the ones who had cared the most, and Avenged Sevenfold's most devoted supporters made very clear that caring that much came with expectations the NFT project had failed to honor. 14. Geoff Tate. Geoff Tate was the voice that made Quintrica one of the most critically respected and fan-devoted bands in progressive metal, and the community that had built their identity around Operation Mindcrime and Empire treated those albums with a reverence that extended directly to the man whose voice made them what they were. The fan base had invested in Tate specifically, in his vocal performances and his lyrical vision, in a way that made the legal battle over the Kenosha name not just a business dispute, but a personal crisis for everyone who had ever treated those records as important. When the band fired him in 2012 and he responded by launching his own touring operation under a variation of the band name, the fan base was forced into a position of choosing sides in a dispute between the voice they had loved and the institution that had produced it. The legal war that followed, two groups touring simultaneously, competing for the same audiences, making competing claims about legitimacy and authenticity, was the most public and sustained fan-splitting event the progressive metal genre had ever produced. The settlement in 2014 resolved the legal question without resolving the emotional one. A significant portion of the fan base that had once been unified around the band's catalog left the whole situation feeling damaged by what the people responsible for the music had done to it. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, Tate's experience reflects the specific version of the phenomenon where the fan community's anger was directed not just at a single decision or statement, but at an entire legal process that had turned their most personal musical investment into a courtroom exhibit. 13. Ronnie Radke. Ronnie Radke built Falling in Reverse specifically around a persona designed to court controversy, and the fan base that attached itself to that persona understood from the beginning that supporting him involved accepting a level of ongoing public drama that supporting most musicians does not require. He had served nearly 3 years in prison before the band existed. And the music he made afterward drew directly from the experience in ways that made the prison history not something to apologize for, but something to present as evidence of authenticity. The fan base that found him through that presentation accepted the terms. What many of those fans did not accept, progressively and then decisively, were the sustained patterns of behavior that went beyond performative bad boy posturing into something that felt genuinely hostile toward the people who were supporting him financially. The social media feuds directed at critics, journalists, and occasionally fans who expressed any form of criticism created an environment in which following Radke required constant navigation of his combativeness. And the accusations about dangerous onstage behavior and interpersonal conduct gave the fan base's more conscientious members reasons to step back that had nothing to do with musical preference. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, his story is the most deliberate. He built an identity around being disliked and then discovered that the fan base attracted by that identity had its own limits about how much of it they were willing to absorb before the relationship stopped feeling worth sustaining. The specific line between provocateur and someone who has simply exhausted the patience of the people giving him their attention is one he has crossed and retreated from and crossed again across the entirety of his career. 12. Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne spent 50 years as one of the most beloved figures in heavy metal and accumulated a fan base whose devotion was as genuine and sustained as any in the genre's history. The core of that fan base had followed him from the Black Sabbath years through the solo peak through the Wilderness years and into the Ozzfest era with a loyalty that survived addiction, controversy, and multiple periods of behavior that would have finished a less mythologically protected musician. Then came The Osbournes, the MTV reality television series that premiered in 22 and invited the world into the domestic reality behind the Prince of Darkness image. The core metal fan base's response to watching the icon they had, built into a figure of transgressive power, navigate grocery shopping, family arguments, and the mundane chaos of a celebrity household was complicated in a way that the show's considerable mainstream success did not adequately capture. The domestication of Ozzy was funny and human, and broadly appealing and represented, to the portion of his audience that had always needed him to be something more than human, a specific kind of disenchantment that the ratings could not measure. His story among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans reflects a version of the phenomenon driven not by controversy or betrayal, but by overexposure of the person behind the myth. The fan base that had needed Ozzy to be the Prince of Darkness found it difficult to sustain that reading after watching him struggle with a television remote control in his living room, and the specific damage done to the mythology by that accessibility has never fully healed in the minds of the genre's most ideologically committed listeners. 11. James Hetfield. James Hetfield co-founded and fronted the biggest heavy metal band in history, and the fan base that had built Metallica into a global institution across the 1980s and 90s held him, specifically responsible for the creative and personal decisions that defined the band's relationship with its audience across the following decades. When the Black Album arrived in 1991 and announced that Metallica had decided to pursue a broader and more commercially accessible sound, the segment of the fan base that had followed them from the thrash years experienced the shift as a personal affront delivered by the person most visibly associated with every choice the band had made. The Some Kind of Monster documentary in 2004 gave that fan base unprecedented access to the interior dynamics of the band during one of its most creatively difficult periods. And the picture of Hetfield that emerged from those recordings was more human and more vulnerable and more professionally uncertain than the mythology around the band had previously allowed. Some fans found the transparency admirable. Others found it impossible to reconcile with the image they had needed him to project. Either way, the documentary removed the comfortable distance that had previously separated the icon from the person. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, his story reflects how the sustained creative decisions of a long career accumulate into a portrait that devoted followers feel entitled to judge against the original terms of the relationship. The haircut, the Black Album, the Napster lawsuit, the documentary. Each individual decision was defensible in isolation. The cumulative effect was a portrait of a man making choices that the fan base that had built him into a legend found consistently difficult to accept on their own terms. 10. Gene Simmons, Noir. Gene Simmons co-created Kiss into one of the most commercially dominant phenomena in rock history, and the fan base that had painted its face, bought the albums, and attended the shows across multiple decades was one of the most organized and demonstrably devoted communities in the genre. The relationship between Kiss and its army of fans was always explicitly commercial, and the band had never pretended otherwise. The merchandise and the branding were always part of the presentation. But there was a line between celebrating the commerce and disappearing into it, and Gene Simmons crossed that line so completely and so consistently that even the fans who had accepted the original commercial framework felt it had been taken somewhere they had not agreed to follow. Kiss coffins, Kiss credit cards, Kiss branded condoms, Kiss air fresheners. The extension of the brand into products that bore no relationship to anything the music represented was accompanied by a public persona from Simmons that progressively alienated the fan base through statements about rock being dead, through claims about his personal life delivered with a self-satisfaction that read as contempt for anyone listening, and through a commercial calculation so naked that the pretense of rock and roll rebellion became genuinely difficult to locate inside the packaging it was being sold from. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, Gene Simmons occupies the position of the musician most completely consumed by the contradiction between what rock and roll is supposed to represent and what he made of it. The fans who had followed Kiss because the music meant something found themselves watching the person most responsible for the band's identity treat everything it had represented as inventory. The anger that followed was not the anger of people who had been lied to. It was the anger of people who had loved something and watched it be converted into a product line. Before moving ahead, take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next story. 9. Scott Stapp. Scott Stapp fronted Creed through one of the most commercially dominant runs in late 90s rock, and a critical contempt that accompanied that commercial success created a specific dynamic in which the fan base that genuinely loved the music was simultaneously aware that the broader culture considered their taste in need of explanation. Rolling Stone readers voted Creed the worst band of the decade in 2013. The gap between the commercial success and the critical reception was one of the widest in rock history, and Stapp sat at the center of that gap as the most visible target for everything the genre's tastemakers found indefensible about the band. His personal behavior across the years following Creed's commercial peak progressively gave even the fan base that had defended the music reasons to step back. The documented public incidents, the erratic social media posts, the video from what appeared to be a hotel room claiming to have $2 remaining in his bank account created a portrait of a man in genuine crisis that the fan base was watching in real time without adequate context for what they were seeing. Defending the music became harder when the person behind it was becoming increasingly difficult to defend as a functional human being. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, his story is the most painful because the fan base that turned on him had never been the critical establishment. They had been the people who actually loved the music and who watched the gap between what the music had promised and what the man was delivering become too wide to bridge. He lost the fans who had defended him to everyone else, which is a specific and devastating kind of abandonment that no amount of subsequent rehabilitation has fully addressed. 8. Marilyn Manson. Marilyn Manson built a career specifically on the fan base that the mainstream rejected. The teenagers who had been told by parents, religious groups, and politicians that the music they were listening to was dangerous and that the person making it was corrupting them. The mutual identification between Manson and those fans was the central dynamic of his entire commercial proposition. He was the outsider who understood them, because he was the outsider too, the person the world was trying to silence who had found a way to make the silencing into the show. The fan base that built him did so because they needed him to be exactly what he said he was. The allegations from multiple former partners beginning in 2020 were a different kind of challenge than anything the moral panic of the 90s had produced, because they came not from the religious right or conservative media, but from people who had personal experience of the private reality behind the public performance of transgression. Evan Rachel Wood's account and the accounts that followed created the specific crisis of a fan base discovering that the person they had identified with as a fellow outsider had allegedly been using the power that their identification had given him in ways that hurt people. His story among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans is the most ideologically complete version of the phenomenon on this list. The fans who had loved him most completely were the ones who had loved him, because he seemed to understand what it felt like to be powerless and targeted. The allegations suggested that the understanding had been performed rather than genuine, which was not just a betrayal of the music, but a betrayal of the specific thing the music had meant to the people who needed it most. 7. Oli Sykes, Bring Me the Horizon. Oli Sykes built Bring Me the Horizon's original fan base through genuinely extreme deathcore music that occupied a specific and demanding corner of heavy metal. And a community that found the band through their earliest recordings was one of the more ideologically committed fan bases the modern extreme metal scene had produced. They had followed a band that was genuinely challenging, that required something from the listener, and their investment in the band was built on the understanding that the music would continue to demand that engagement rather than retreat from it towards something more accessible. What followed across successive albums was one of the most gradual and then most complete transformations of a heavy band's sonic identity in the genre's recent history. Each record moved further from the deathcore origins towards something that, by the time of the band's later releases, had essentially no audible connection to the music that had built the original audience. The screaming disappeared. The breakdowns disappeared. The heaviness disappeared. What arrived in its place was polished pop-influenced rock with electronic production that charted well and reached a much larger audience than the deathcore records ever had. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, Sykes represents the most complete musical betrayal on the list. A frontman whose creative evolution was genuine and whose right to pursue. That evolution was defensible, but whose decision to take the band's name and the fan base's loyalty with him into a completely different genre created an anger in the original audience that the new audiences' enthusiasm could never adequately compensate for. He did not lose fans. He replaced them with different ones. The original fans noticed the distinction. 6. Fred Durst. Fred Durst stood at the front of Limp Bizkit during the commercial peak of nu metal and became the most immediately recognizable face of a genre whose commercial dominance was matched by its critical dismissal from virtually every corner of the music press that was not being paid to cover it. The fan base that had built Limp Bizkit into one of the most commercially successful acts of the late 90s and early 2000s was large enough and devoted enough to sustain the band through consistent critical contempt. Then Woodstock 99 arrived and changed the terms of the argument. The festival's descent into violence and sexual assault during and after the band's set became the defining public event associated with Durst's name and the band's legacy. And the accusations that his onstage behavior during the performance had escalated rather than managed an already volatile crowd created a moral dimension to the criticism that went considerably beyond simple questions of musical taste. The argument was no longer about whether the music was good. It was about whether the person making it had contributed to conditions in which people were hurt. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, his story is the most publicly catastrophic in terms of a single event's capacity to redefine a career's entire meaning. The fans who had defended Limp Bizkit against musical criticism found themselves unable to defend the Woodstock Association with the same ease. The backward cap and the arrogance that had read as swagger during the commercial peak read as something considerably less forgivable in the context of what happened at that festival, and the fan base never fully recovered the uncomplicated enthusiasm for him that had preceded that weekend. 5. Dave Mustaine. Dave Mustaine built Megadeth into one of the most important bands in thrash metal history, and the fan base that followed him through the classic period of the band's discography was among the most musically devoted and intellectually serious in the genre. They had chosen Megadeth specifically, in many cases, as an alternative to the more commercially successful and critically celebrated Metallica, and their identification with the band carried the specific intensity of people who had made a considered musical choice rather than simply followed the biggest thing available. When Mustaine began expressing his political and religious views with increasing frequency and directness, that fan base was confronted with a portrait of the man behind the music that many of them found genuinely difficult to reconcile with the music itself. His conversion to Christianity and his subsequent expression of conservative political positions on abortion, immigration, and other contested social questions created a sustained and ongoing alienation of a significant portion of the fan base that had built its identity around music that had always seemed to occupy a different ideological space. The comments about a sitting president being responsible for mass shootings generated genuine mainstream outrage. The statements about immigration and other political subjects generated quieter but equally significant losses within the metal community that had sustained him across decades of recording and touring. His story among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans is the most politically specific on the list. A musician whose fan base's consumption of his music had never required them to agree with his worldview because he had never previously insisted on sharing it so consistently or so confrontationally. The fans who left were not leaving because of creative decisions. They were leaving because the person making the music had become someone whose public positions made continued engagement feel like a form of endorsement they were not willing to provide. 4. Axl Rose. Axl Rose was the most commercially dominant rock frontman on the planet in the early 90s, and the fan base that had built Guns N' Roses into a global institution had given him a level of devotion that should have been essentially unconditional in practice. He converted that devotion into one of the most comprehensive fan alienation campaigns in rock history through a combination of decisions that individually might have been survivable, but collectively produced a portrait of a performer who viewed the audience not as the people who made everything possible, but as an inconvenience to be managed on his own terms and timeline. Starting concerts hours late, sometimes not appearing until past midnight. Jumping into the crowd to confront a fan with a camera during a show in St. Louis and triggering a riot that caused millions in damages. Walking off stage in Montreal after Metallica's James Hetfield had been injured, keeping the audience waiting for hours, then delivering a truncated set that generated one of the most destructive concert riots in the genre's history. Each incident added to an account that the fan base was keeping, and that by the mid-90s had accumulated into something they were no longer willing to balance against the talent that had originally justified the investment. Among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, his case is the most sustained and most well-documented record of a musician systematically testing the loyalty of a genuinely devoted audience until the testing produced results he had apparently not expected. The fans who waited for hours in arenas around the world had a point of tolerance, and he found it repeatedly. The talent was never the question. The treatment of the people who showed up to be in the presence of the talent was the question, and his answers across a decade of onstage behavior eventually produced the backlash that the music alone could never have generated. 3. Phil Anselmo. Phil Anselmo was one of the most genuinely revered frontmen in the history of heavy metal, and the community that had built Pantera into one of the genre's most important acts held him with the specific devotion reserved for people who have delivered something that felt genuinely irreplaceable. The groove-driven intensity of Pantera's most celebrated recordings and Anselmo's raw presence on those tracks had earned him a place inside the fan base's emotional geography that most musicians never reach. He was not just liked, he was trusted with something real. That trust made what happened in 2016 not just a controversy, but a betrayal at a scale proportional to what had been given. At a tribute concert for Dimebag Darrell, his murdered former bandmate and the most beloved figure in the community's recent memory, Anselmo ended the show by raising his arm in what appeared to be a Nazi salute and shouting "White Power" at the audience. The apology that followed described it as a drunken joke about white wine. For most of the community that had gathered to honor Dimebag Darrell, the explanation made the incident worse rather than better. They had assembled to celebrate someone they loved, and Anselmo had made the night about something they found indefensible. His story at position 3 among the 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans sits there because the specific context of the betrayal made it more damaging than any of the others on this list. This was not a political statement or a creative decision or a business dispute. This was a moment at a tribute to a murdered friend in front of the community that had grieved that murder, that converted the grief of the occasion into something the community could not absorb without choosing a position. Most of them chose the same position. Phil Anselmo has been navigating the consequences ever since. 2. Lars Ulrich. Lars Ulrich helped build Metallica from a garage band playing thrash metal in San Francisco into the biggest heavy metal act in history. And the fan base that had made that journey with the band across the 1980s had done so partly because the band's anti-establishment image resonated with people who needed music that positioned itself against the commercial and institutional forces that surrounded them. The underground tape trading culture that had helped build Metallica's early audience was the precise origin point of the ethos that Lars appeared to be attacking when Metallica launched their lawsuit against Napster in the year 2000. He submitted a list of over 300,000 individual Napster users to the service with a request that each of them be banned from the platform. He testified before the United States Senate on the subject. He became the public face of a major commercial institution, taking legal action against the fans who were using a free service to access and share the music. The fans who had spent years defending Metallica against the accusation that the Black Album represented a sellout now had something considerably harder to defend. A band that had built its reputation on opposing the establishment, delivering a list of fan names to lawyers. His story at position 2 on the list of 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans is the most commercially consequential version of the phenomenon, because the damage it did was not just to his personal reputation, but to the band's entire self-presentation as something different from the corporate machinery it had spent the 80s positioning itself against. Fans burned CDs in public. The internet turned him into a meme. The specific injury was not just to the relationship between the band and its audience, but to the story the band had always told about what it stood for. Lars Ulrich did not just disappoint the fanbase. He proved a version of the story about Metallica that the fanbase had spent years refusing to believe. 1. James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich. The full accounting of how Metallica was eaten alive by its own fans requires treating the band rather than a single member as the subject, because no other act in the history of heavy metal has managed to generate the same sustained and recurring pattern of fan alienation across such a long period while simultaneously remaining one of the genre's most commercially dominant institutions. The Black Album in 1991 announced to the portion of the fan base built on the thrash years that the band had decided the music they had made together mattered less than the audience the music could reach if it was made differently. That was the first significant act of fan alienation, and it was enormous. Then came the haircuts, which sounds trivial and was not trivial in the context of what long hair meant to the specific community being asked to absorb the change. Then came Load and Reload, albums that continued the creative evolution in directions the thrash fan base experienced as progressive abandonment rather than artistic growth. Then came the Napster lawsuit and the 300,000 names and the Senate testimony and the CD burning. Then came Some Kind of Monster and a documentary portrait of a band in therapy arguing about how to exist. A portrait that was honest and human, and that the portion of the fan base that needed Metallica to be larger than human found genuinely destabilizing. They are number 1 on the list of 15 heavy metal stars eaten alive by their own fans, not because any single decision was the most damaging on the list, but because no other act has managed to generate comparable fan alienation repeatedly, cyclically, and across such a sustained period, while the commercial success continued demonstrating that enough of the audience was still present to sustain the institution, regardless of how many people the individual decisions drove away. Metallica has been the band most hated by its own fans for more than 30 years. That specific achievement, maintaining that relationship with the people who built you while the money keeps coming in, is unlike anything else the genre has ever produced. And there they are, 15 musicians and bands who discovered that the devotion of a metal fan base is proportional to the fury it produces when it feels betrayed. The genre's fans give everything. They expect something in return. Not perfection, not commercial restraint, not even particularly good behavior. They expect to feel that the music and the person making it are real. When that feeling breaks, the people who gave the most are the first to arrive at the wreckage and the last to leave it. Which betrayal on this list hit you the hardest, and which musician do you think deserved the backlash they received? Drop it in the comments below. If this video got you thinking, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what we uncover next.